Okay. Now, this next thing is, I think, very interesting. When I was in graduate school, I was told that with post-traumatic stress disorder, obviously, oftentimes people will dissociate at the time of the trauma, or they may, in fact, actually develop full-blown amnesia for the traumatic event. And this was a defense against overwhelm, and it was a blessing, because if you could somehow numb yourself, it wouldn't have as severe impact on you, or if you could completely be amnestic for what happened, then you didn't have to sit around and think about and remember this. And that has face validity, but it doesn't have true validity, because it turns out, especially in studies they did after the World Trade Center terrorist attack, that generated lots of research. They looked at what are the factors that predict a more poor outcome for people that were exposed to these terrible events. And one close to the top of the list was where people either were markedly dissociated during the event or completely amnestic for the event. Okay, interesting. Now, if you go back to Edna Foa's work, but not just hers, all of psychotherapy has to do, and this is true with EMDR too, is eventually get in a place where you can put together a narrative. You can say, this happened, and then this, and then this, and this, and get clarity about that, and be able to talk about it eventually where it's not overwhelming. That seems to be a central feature for healing with PTSD. But what if, when the event is occurring, there's this massive change in one's mental status, and you dissociate profoundly during the event? I would liken it to, if I were going to take a movie of a birthday party with a video camera, smearing Vaseline on the lens and taking a picture, and then later try to replay it. What's going to happen? The encoding of information is being distorted in states of dissociation. Does that make any sense? So it may feel like a blessing in the moment, but it predicts a more poor prognosis in terms of PTSD outcome. Now, having said that, let's take a look at some very interesting research. The hippocampus, critical brain structure for encoding new information. Okay, absolutely critical. No theory here. This is a proven fact that it's essential for that. Now, I can't remember if I talked about these molecules in the first class or not, but when you have synapses form in the brain, about 90% of them occur between a spine coming off of a dendrite, okay, and then the terminal end of another nerve cell. And the vast majority of synapses occur like that. And so these spines grow and they retract depending on experiences. So you have a spine that grows, and then there is, adjacent to this is this nerve terminal, and they seek each other out in some way, because they're kind of they're floating around in this fluid inside the brain. And as you know, with rare exceptions, most synapses, when they are established, they don't actually touch one another. There's a tiny space in between. But what happens is when the nerve terminal then comes up in close proximity with this would be the postsynaptic side. This is like a dendrite spine. A part of what happens is it needs to become stabilized to become functional. And the way this happens then is it starts laying down these molecules that are referred to as neuronal cell adhesion molecules, and it's like the glue that kind of secures the synapse together. Now it's a lot like a boat, like a big ocean liner that's tied up to a dock with maybe 10 different tie lines that more or less secures it to the boat dock, okay? And then it becomes functional, okay, and it works. Now, there is another molecule called PSA, and it's not on the slide here. It's polysialic acid, although that's not necessary to know. But if you have higher levels of PSA, it tends to then bind to and disintegrate NCAM. Okay, so in a sense, this is like the glue, okay, but this is the solvent. Now, what happens when there is extraordinarily severe trauma in mammals, there is a surge of cortisol that's released from the adrenal glands. And the vast majority of PTSD people, this cortisol level is very high, and then quickly, rather quickly, within minutes or hours, gets back down to normal. Most people that have severe PTSD are not walking around with elevated cortisol levels, okay? But at the time of the trauma, there can be this huge increase of cortisol. And what's been found is that high cortisol levels, so this would be in the immediate aftermath of a traumatic event, will cause PSA to bind more readily to NCAM in the hippocampus and start unplugging these synapses. And within minutes to hours, you have a disconnect of hundreds and hundreds of millions of synapses in the hippocampus. And in a very real sense, let me see if I got a slide here. No, I'm sorry, I don't have a slide. But in a very real sense, quickly, the hippocampus gets disabled. It gets unplugged and cannot consolidate the memory, okay? And it may, within a few days, start reestablishing connections, but for a while, it is massively disabled. And this would be an explanation for why people have a very fuzzy memory or are completely amnestic for the traumatic events. Now, I think there's a lot of evidence to suggest there's also psychogenic amnesia, where people repress memories. But this is a different kind of amnesia where actually the memory is absolutely not there because the hippocampus wasn't able to consolidate the memory. What this leads to is this, which is cool, is it's been discovered that this drug, Inderol, beta blocker, right? We talked about before for public speaking anxiety. People have said for years and years and years, oh, this doesn't work up in the brain. It's out here in the periphery. It blocks adrenaline and norepinephrine receptors. Absolutely true. But what it looks like is that if you administer a beta blocker, and the only one that's been studied so far is Inderol, okay, that it has an effect on this. And what it does is this, that Inderol given within hours after the traumatic event, okay, blocks the binding of PSA to NCAM molecules in the hippocampus, and it maintains a functional hippocampus so you can remember what happened. Plus, guess what else? It blocks all these adrenaline and norepinephrine receptors out here, and it reduces anxiety. Yes, ma'am?
You said given within an hour of the trauma?
You know what? It's unclear about what is a critical time frame, okay? And the people that talk about this say in the immediate aftermath, meaning within minutes or hours. And I think that subsequent research will probably clarify how quickly this has to happen. But the important thing I wanted to share with you is that clonidine, for reasons we talked about a few minutes ago, okay, very rapidly reducing arousal in the locus coeruleus, and the use of Inderol to preserve the integrity of the hippocampus following trauma look like two rapid interventions that may have very high yield in terms of preventing people from moving in the direction of PTSD that is very, very hard to treat. I got to tell you something. Some of these people have chronic PTSD. It just ruins their life. It destroys families. People coming back with combat-related PTSD, the divorce rates are out the roof, destroying families. And I mean, the best thing in the world is to avoid traumatic exposure, obviously. I'd suggest let's not go to war, maybe. But in the absence of that, are there ways to come in and quickly do something that have an effect on reducing the likelihood for more severe outcomes? And both of these experimental approaches, I think, look very promising. Yes, ma'am.
If we were going to try and do this in a combat situation, when would this be administered? With that critical period between minutes and hours and that chronic trauma situation that soldiers go through, would they just keep it in their pockets and chew it at the end of the day, or like how would that work?
I mean, it's a great question. I don't know the answer. Also, there's another thing that complicates things. In combat situations, one thing that they found is the most common reaction, acute reaction, is to be numb and not be flooded with anxiety. And oftentimes it's after the soldiers have been removed from the immediate site of the battle that then they start developing intrusive symptoms. So there may be some of these people that are not identified early enough because they're not showing whopping anxiety attacks and that kind of stuff. But you know, I'm just really concerned about this. You know, large 20% of people coming back from Iraq and Afghanistan have either depression or PTSD. And probably everybody here has heard about the huge number of suicides that are occurring among returning veterans. But then God knows how many people will get sexual assaults and all kinds of bad things. And so rather than wait, for months or years, and then we try to put the pieces back together, to the extent that in psychiatry they can figure out ways to get in there right away and do something, I think that that's exciting and promising. But this is experimental. Okay?
Question.
Yeah.
Does this information apply to children?
Good question. And does it apply to children? And I don't know the answer because I haven't seen any studies with kids. Now, because these drugs are very safe compared to most other psychiatric drugs, I think there's a great opportunity here for research, and I think it's promising. But once again, the whole issue is kids are not just miniature adults. It's hard to really know what's going to happen.